Okay, so welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to kind of pull back the curtain on a pretty intense disagreement in a religious movement.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a good way to put it. We've got two letters here, and it's interesting they offer some really strikingly different perspectives on the same situation.
And just to give folks a little bit of background, what exactly are these letters? What are we working with today?
Yeah, so we have one letter from a guy named Michael Williamson. He's a leader in the International Christian Churches. That's the ICC in London, specifically. And his letter is addressed to his church community.
Okay.
Alongside that, we also have this really detailed response letter. And this is from George Grimma, who was also part of the church. And this is directed back to London ICC. So it's
hmm
kind of like two sides of the same coin, a major falling out.
A disfellowshipping, right?
Exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
disfellowshipping. So it's about trying to understand why that happened from both points of view.
So our goal here is to really dig into this, right? We want to see the accusations, see the responses, understand all the context, and ultimately get a clearer picture of how these kinds of conflicts happen within a church setting.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there are a lot of layers to unpack here, and hopefully we can shed some light on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with Williamson's letter. What's the main gist of his message? What is he trying to communicate to his church?
Right from the beginning, he's very direct about the situation. He mentions this, marking this disfellowshipping of George and Angelica Grima, and he does it with what he calls great sadness.
Okay, interesting word choice there, sadness.
Yeah, and he immediately frames their actions as influenced by Satan. He talks about bitterness and causing division within the church. So he's setting a very particular tone right off the bat.
So then what specific justifications does he give for this disfellowshipping? What's the basis for his actions?
He primarily accuses George and Angelica of causing division and deceitfully pulling away members from the London ICC to join another group, the International Churches of Christ, or the ICOC.
And just to clarify for listeners, is that the same organization or are these two distinct groups?
They are distinct. There's a whole history there,
Yeah.
but for our purposes today, it's important to know that they are separate and there's clearly some tension between them.
Got it. So George and Angelica had moved their membership to this other group, the ICOC.
That's what Williamson claims. And he says that because of that, the leadership felt they had no choice but to mark them for slander and divisiveness.
Okay, that's a pretty strong statement. And he even quotes scripture to back up his position, doesn't he?
He does. He quotes from the book of Titus specifically about having nothing to do with divisive people. So he's really grounding his actions in biblical authority as he sees it.
So this is not just a personal disagreement. It's a matter of spiritual principle for him.
Exactly. And he even delves into some past history between them to further illustrate his point.
Oh, really? What kind of history?
He goes back to 2015 when the Grimmas were living in London. And he says they were discipled for over a year regarding their exorbitant spending and what he calls greed. He claims they didn't heed this advice and eventually ran out of money.
Okay.
This is what supposedly led them to move to Los Angeles.
Hmm.
But Williamson notes that before they left the London church, actually helped them with some of their personal expenses, like rent, as a gesture of gratitude for their past contributions to the church.
So already we're seeing a bit of a complex relationship, some financial entanglements even back then.
Yeah, definitely some pre-existing dynamics at play.
So what happens when they move to LA?
According to Williamson, the church there tried to help them get on their feet. They hired George at Mercy Y Worldwide, which is a ministry associated with the ICC.
Okay.
But he says George was ineffective in fundraising and ultimately lost the job.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then despite advice from their disciplers in L.A. and even Williamson himself, the Grimmas decided to move back to London.
They went.
Yeah, they went back to start a consultancy business. So, it seems like maybe they were trying to make a fresh start or something.
So how did the London church receive them when they returned?
Williamson claims they welcomed them back and tried to support them, but their financial difficulties continued, so there were repeated requests for assistance from the church.
I see. So this financial strain seems to have been a recurring issue for them.
It does seem that way, and Williamson says that during this time, George and Angelica developed what he calls extreme bitterness and distrust towards the ICC leaders in Los Angeles.
That's interesting, right? He keeps coming back to this idea of bitterness.
Yeah, it's definitely a central theme in his narrative.
So he's portraying them as being disgruntled and resentful.
Exactly. And he says that after several attempts by various leaders to address these issues, George had what he calls a fit of rage during a meeting.
Oh, wow. A fit of rage.
Yeah, and this is apparently when he was asked to unify with and apologize to the LA leadership for what Williamson considered to be slanderous statements, but George refused.
So things escalated quite a bit at this point.
Yeah, definitely. It went beyond just disagreements about finances or leadership. It got very heated.
And then Williamson lays out some pretty serious allegations, doesn't he?
He does. He claims that George lied about poisoning a former disciple who was being restored to the church, and also that he secretly recorded conversations with other disciples without their consent.
Wow. Those are some very serious accusations.
Yeah, they definitely add another layer of complexity and seriousness to the whole situation.
And then there's this whole thing about an email that was sent during the Global Leadership Conference, the GLC.
Yeah, that seems to have been a pivotal moment in this whole conflict.
No, right, because for anyone not familiar with this world, the GLC is like a big deal, right?
Oh, yeah, it's a major gathering for leaders within the movement, so it's a very significant event.
Okay, so what happened with this email?
Well, Williamson describes receiving this 13-page email from George and Angelica while he was at the GLC in Manila, and it was addressed to the entire London church.
Oh, wow. So they sent this out to everyone while he was away?
Yeah, and he calls the email very divisive and even satanic. He says its purpose was to lure their disciples away to join the ICOC.
So from Williamson's perspective, this was a deliberate act of sabotage almost.
That's definitely the implication, and he uses some very strong language to condemn their actions.
He even calls them dangerous, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. He claims that George has been actively reaching out to current ICC members, people who have left the church, and even non-Christians, encouraging them to join the ICOC.
So he's painting a picture of George as actively working against the ICC.
Yeah, and he describes the ICOC as languishing in lukewarmness. He even references a book by Gordon Ferguson to highlight what he sees as low baptism rates in the ICOC as evidence of their lack of spiritual vitality.
So in his view, George and Angelica are not only leaving, they're actively trying to pull others into what he considers to be a lesser movement.
Exactly. And his response is pretty decisive. He instructs all church members to block and delete George and Angelica from all contact, and he even names 4 other individuals he considers to be co-conspirators.
Wow, so this is a complete severing of ties.
It seems that way he's urging his church to completely cut them off.
And how does he end this letter?
He ends with a prayer for George and Angelica to escape the trap of the devil, who he says has taken them captive to do his will.
So he's really framing this as a spiritual battle.
Yeah, and he's leaving no room for doubt about where he stands on the issue. He sees them as being deceived and under the influence of evil.
Okay, well, that gives us a very clear picture of Williamson's side of the story. Now, let's turn to George Grimpian's response letter, which, as you said, is much longer. And he explicitly says it's a reaction to some specific sermons that were delivered.
Yes, exactly. He starts off by naming 4 people: Michael Williamson, Colby Gray, Michael Hart, and Samuel Ajayi. He says these guys all delivered sermons on Sunday, July 2nd, 2017.
Okay.
And the sermons were specifically addressing him and Angelica, and he actually apologizes for the delay in responding. He says he was hoping to resolve these issues privately with Kip McKeon.
Who is Kip McKeon?
Oh, sorry, Kip McKeon is another influential leader in these church movements. He was actually a founder of the ICOC originally.
Got it. So George was hoping to work things out quietly with Kip and Williamson.
That's what he says, and this desire for private resolution right from the start kind of suggests a different approach, right?
Yeah, it hints at a different attitude. Maybe he wasn't looking for a public confrontation.
Yeah, possibly. And then he goes on to quote Proverbs 18.17, which says, "The first to present his case seems right till another comes forward and questions him."
Okay, so he's setting himself up as the one to offer that other perspective.
He's saying, hey, there's another side to this story. And he also quotes Ezekiel 3.2021, which talks about the responsibility to warn even righteous people if they turn to evil. So he's framing his lengthy response as fulfilling that responsibility.
So he's not just defending himself, he's suggesting that he has a duty to speak out.
Yeah, and right away he acknowledges that there were unresolved conflicts with both Williamson and Kip. He even compares their situation to the biblical account of Paul and Barnabas, who had a significant disagreement.
Right, even those early church leaders had conflict.
Exactly. So he's saying, look, this kind of thing happens even among strong believers.
I see. And then he goes a step further and provides a transcript of a portion of Williamson's sermon.
Yeah, he really wants to address Williamson's words directly.
So what does he focus on in that transcript? What were the main points that Williamson made about this brother who George clearly believes is himself?
Well, according to the transcript, Williamson accuses this brother of gossip and slander without repentance, and he also says this brother disagreed with the leadership decisions, using what he called a mocking tone.
And what examples does he give?
Williamson says the brothers said things like, "I don't like it," and you're not doing it right.
So basically questioning their authority.
Yeah, and Williamson then brings up Deuteronomy 17, which talks about contempt for leaders, and he claims this brother had an attitude even towards the leadership in L.A.
Okay, so that's tying back to that whole bitterness thing.
Exactly. And he also mentions this 5-day challenge.
What was that about?
Well, in the sermon, Williamson says he challenged this brother to call the L.A. leadership and get unified within 5 days. But it sounds like that didn't happen.
Oh, so another point of contention.
Yeah, and Williamson also mentions the brother sending a text message saying, "I've fallen away, I'm leaving." So he's presenting this as a clear indication of rebellion.
So at this point in the sermon, Williamson basically lays out the Matthew 18 process of church discipline, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. He talks about trying to win the brother over privately, then involving a few others, and finally bringing it before the whole church.
Right, so there's a whole process that's supposed to be followed.
Exactly. And he says that if the person still doesn't repent, then they have to be treated like a pagan or a tax collector, essentially cutting off close contact.
Okay, and then he compares this to the prodigal son, right?
Yeah, he says just like the prodigal son, someone who has fallen away needs to come back on their own. No one went looking for the prodigal son.
So he's saying they're going to wait for George to come to his senses and repent.
That's what he's saying, and he even explicitly states that this is why George has fallen away from the faith.
So that's a very strong statement to make publicly.
It is, and it's interesting because even though he says that George has fallen away, he also claims that this public address isn't meant to shame him.
So what is the purpose then, according to Williamson?
He says he's praying for George's return. He emphasizes his love for him and how much this situation breaks his heart. But he feels obligated to teach the whole counsel of God, as he puts it, even the tough parts about the devil's influence.
So it's like a warning to the rest of the church.
Yeah, he even uses the example of John Mark, who initially faltered but later returned and became strong. So he's holding out hope that George will do the same.
But for now, he's saying George is no longer considered a disciple.
That's right. He's drawing a clear line.
Okay, so that's the part of Williamson's sermon that George really wants to respond to. So how does he do that? How does he start building his own narrative?
Well, he claims that he actually requested a meeting with Williamson on March 26, 2017, right after a church service.
Oh, so he initiated contact.
Yeah, and this was in response to an email he had sent earlier that day expressing concerns about Williamson's harshness, gossip, and slander, and how he was handling Simon Oxton's restoration.
Okay, so he's saying he wasn't just sitting back and grumbling. He was actively trying to address his concerns.
Exactly. And he lists 6 specific areas of concern that he wanted to discuss with Williamson.
What are those?
The first one was a comment that Williamson allegedly made at a men's meeting about women being prone to gossip and wives shouldn't advise leadership on how to run the movement.
That does sound potentially problematic.
Yeah, and George felt it was directed at his wife, Angelica. And apparently Anthony almost confirmed that Williamson was talking about Angelica and other women.
So it wasn't just George misinterpreting things.
It seems not. And George also mentions past unresolved issues between Angelica and Williamson that they had tried to address before. So there's a history there.
Okay, so that's one point of contention. What's the next one?
George says that Williamson slandered Angelica to Simon Oxton by saying she wasn't a leader.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He reminds Williamson that Angelica actually played a key role in persuading Kip McKeon to start the new movement. So he's highlighting her past contributions.
So he's defending her reputation.
Exactly. Although he does note that Williamson later apologized to Angelica for this comment.
Okay, so that was at least partially resolved.
It seems so. But then the third concern was about Rebecca Oxton.
Simon Oxton's wife.
Yes. She was apparently pressured by another church member to confess contempt towards the leadership as part of her restoration process.
That sounds like a tricky situation.
It does, and George is suggesting that this pressure might have come from an email Rebecca sent to Kip McKeon expressing concerns about Williamson's harshness.
So there were a lot of different lines of communication happening and maybe some conflicting messages.
Yeah, and then the fourth concern was that Williamson allegedly implied there would be negative consequences for Rebecca if she contacted Kip McKeon directly.
Oh, wow. So controlling who she could talk to.
That's how George perceived it. And his fifth concern was about an instance where Williamson showed disrespect to Simon Oxton in a text message right before a church meeting.
So again, this is about Williamson's behavior and how he treats people.
Exactly. And the sixth concern was that Williamson challenged Simon to baptize someone on the very day of his restoration, even though Simon was going through some personal challenges.
That's a lot to put on someone who's just coming back into the fold.
Yeah. George felt it was insensitive and maybe even harmful.
So he had a lot to unpack in this meeting with Williamson.
He did, but he says they only had time to discuss a few of these concerns. And he emphasizes that Williamson didn't accuse him of gossip or slander at that time.
Okay.
And he wasn't given a formal warning, according to the Matthew 18 process. Williamson apparently just told him he was proud and harsh.
So not a full-blown confrontation yet.
Not yet, but they agreed to have another meeting to continue the conversation.
Okay, and that second meeting happened at the Dorset Hotel.
Yes, but it wasn't just George and Williamson this time. Williamson brought Anthony Olmos and Michael Hart with him.
Oh, so more people involved now.
Yeah. And George says even after this meeting, he still wasn't accused of gossip or asked to apologize for anything related to finances. He didn't receive a formal warning or anything like that.
So what did they talk about then?
Well, George says Williamson mostly denied his concerns, but he did say he'd think about the comment he made about women in the church.
Okay, so some slight acknowledgement there.
Yeah, but George also mentions being accused of slandering Williamson by telling Angelica that he was upset about that comment about women.
Oh, so now they're accusing him of the very thing he's concerned about.
It does seem that way.
Okay, so then there's this email exchange about Simon Oxton's restoration.
Yes. In an email dated June 7, 2017, George expressed concern about how Sean Corrigan was leading Simon's study.
Who is Sean Corrigan?
Oh, sorry. Sean Corrigan is another leader in the church, and George felt that Simon was being given zero hope and that Corrigan's approach was too harsh.
Okay, so again, he's questioning the methods being used.
Exactly. And in that same email, he mentioned Simon's questions about church finances, and he connected this to his own concerns about the finances of the LA church.
Which he wanted to discuss with Kip McKeon.
Right, but Williamson responded by questioning their unity and Simon's sincerity.
So it seems like he wasn't really receptive to these concerns.
Not really. And then he specifically asked if George had discussed church finances directly with Simon.
Oh, so now they're scrutinizing his conversations with other members.
Yeah, and George sent back a very detailed email explaining that Simon's questions about finances came up naturally in the context of missing a special mission service collection.
So it wasn't like he was planting seeds of doubt or anything.
That's what he's saying, and he said Simon agreed to ask Victor, the church administrator, about it, and that George's involvement was minimal.
So he's pushing back against Williamson's accusations.
Yeah, and he also disagreed with Williamson's suggestion to stop studying with Simon for a month. And he voiced his continued concerns about Sean Corrigan's approach.
Okay, so we're seeing this back and forth, these different philosophies about how to handle this restoration.
Yeah, they're not on the same page at all.
And then they have that third meeting at the Dorset Hotel, which sounds like it was much more confrontational.
Yes, this one seems to have been a turning point, even though George requested to meet only with Williamson. Michael Hart, Anthony Olmos, and Sean Corrigan were all there too.
Oh, wow. So it was like an intervention.
It kind of sounds that way, and
Oh.
George says that's when Williamson really laid into him, called him a gossip and a slanderer, issued a warning for contempt, and gave him a 5-day ultimatum to unify with the LA leadership.
By calling Kip McKeon?
Right. And George claims that he, in turn, warned Williamson for gossip, slander, evil suspicions, and mistreatment of Simon Oxton. So it was a very heated exchange.
So they're both accusing each other now.
Yeah, it's a full-blown conflict at this point.
And then Williamson follows up with that warning for contempt email, right?
He sends it on June 13th, 2017, and it basically reiterates everything from the meeting.
He talks about pride, disunity, and contempt.
Exactly. And he even brings up Deuteronomy 17.12 about disregarding authority. And he mentions past admonishments he's given George for slander and pride.
So he's building a case against him.
Yeah. And he ends the email by saying that if this behavior continues, they'll move to the third step of church discipline, which is bringing the issue before the whole church.
So that's a serious threat.
Very serious. And then the very next day, George decides to call Kip McKeon directly.
He goes straight to the top.
He wants to get Kip's take on the situation.
And what happens in that phone call?
Well, George asks Kip if he authorized the charge of contempt against him.
And
Kip confirms that he did. He says he was in agreement with Williamson's actions.
wow, okay, so Kip's on board with all of this.
He is, and he even adds that George and Angelica were already considered to be in contempt for not fully participating in the European Missions Conference the previous year.
Oh, wow. So that's another issue that's been brewing.
Yeah, and George explains that they couldn't afford to go, but Kip says they should have found a way even if it meant begging.
Oof, that's harsh.
Yeah, and Kip also shares his view that hurt leads to being contemptuous, which is interesting.
So he's saying their hurt feelings are making them rebellious.
It sounds that way. And he confirms that he gave Williamson directions on how to handle Simon and Rebecca Oxton's situation.
So he's very involved in all of this.
He is. And then George brings up his concerns about the finances of the LA church, although he doesn't give details in his letter.
Okay, so he's raising those concerns again.
Yeah, and finally, Kip challenges George to apologize to Williamson and demonstrate unity with the leadership.
So she's essentially telling him to fall in line.
Pretty much.
And how does George respond to that?
Well, just hours after the call with Kip, he sends an email to Williamson apologizing for his attitude and any disrespect he's shown.
So he's trying to make amends.
He says he's spoken with Kip and that he'll also reach out to Michael Kirchner and Mick Bordieri, who are other leaders.
Okay, so he's really trying to smooth things over.
Yeah, he even follows up with a text message to Williamson to try to arrange a meeting.
But it seems like those attempts at reconciliation ultimately failed.
Yeah, sadly, it doesn't sound like that meeting ever happened.
So what happens next?
Well, on June 18th, George sends a text message to Anthony Olmos, not directly to Williamson, saying that he and Angelica are leaving the church.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he says they can't stay because of the warning and Kip's support of it, and he specifically mentions Kip's judgment about their absence from the European Missions Conference.
So that seems to have been a major sticking point for them.
It does. And later that same day, Angelica exchanges text messages with another church member named Cassidy, expressing their hurt and disappointment with Kip.
So they're feeling very betrayed by him.
Yeah, it's clear that they felt deeply wounded by this whole experience.
And does George try to address this with any other leaders?
Yes, he speaks with Michael Kirchner and requests that the warning be retracted and that he and Angelica receive a public apology.
Okay.
Kirchner agrees to communicate this to Kip McKeon, but George says he never heard back from either of them.
So they just ignored him.
It seems that way, and then Williamson and the other leaders go ahead and discuss George and Angelica publicly during the Sunday services on July 2nd.
The sermons that George referenced at the beginning of his letter.
Exactly. And George also points out that Williamson had apparently intended to bring him before the church even before their third meeting.
Which George felt wasn't in line with the Matthew 18 process.
Right. He feels like they weren't following their own procedures.
Okay. And George also brings up some concerns about the overall health of the London church.
Yeah, he mentions that they had a significant loss of members in 2016 and that the trend was continuing in 2017.
Okay.
And he says he brought this to Williamson's attention, but Williamson blamed the members themselves.
So he wasn't taking responsibility for the decline.
Not according to George.
Okay, so despite all of this back and forth, George says he has forgiven both Williamson and Kip.
He does. But he makes it clear that while he forgives them personally, he can no longer work with them or support certain aspects of their behavior.
Which he believes are harmful to the church.
Exactly. And he also pushes back against Williamson's claim that he, along with John Mark and Barnabas, have fallen away from the faith.
Okay.
He brings up the biblical example of Paul and Barnabas again, pointing out that Barnabas continued to be regarded positively even after their disagreement. So he's saying disagreement doesn't equal falling away.
Right. There can be disagreements even among faithful people.
Exactly.
And ultimately, where do George and Angelica end up?
They joined the London branch of the ICOC.
Okay, so the very group that Williamson was accusing them of trying to lure people away to, and what leads them to this decision?
Well, George says that after leaving the ICC, they spent time praying and fasting and seeking guidance. And then they reached out to Mohan Nanjundan, who's the leader of the London ICOC.
Okay.
And George speaks very highly of Mohan and his wife, Helen.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about the humility, love, and transparency they showed.
So they felt welcomed and accepted.
Yeah, and they attended services at the London ICOC and were really impressed by the sense of community and love among the members.
So they found a new home, so to speak.
It seems that way. And George also mentions that he was actually involved in helping to build that very church back in the 1980s.
Oh, wow. So he has a long history with that congregation.
He does. Then he even shares some statistics. He claims that, contrary to what ICC leaders have said, the London ICOC has actually grown a lot in recent years.
So he's directly contradicting Williamson's assessment.
Yeah, he's presenting a very different picture of the ICOC.
And this seems to be a major point of contention, right? Williamson sees the ICOC as backsliding, while George sees it as thriving.
Exactly, and George believes that it's time for healing and unity between the ICC and ICOC churches in London. He acknowledges that there have been issues on both sides, but he emphasizes the positive transformation he's seen in the London ICOC.
And he calls for respect and dialogue.
Yes, he ends his letter by quoting John 17, which is all about unity among believers.
Mm-hmm.
And he offers to answer any questions and encourages people to share his letter.
Wow, this is a really complex situation. So many layers of personal history disagreements about leadership and church discipline, and these fundamentally different perspectives on these religious movements. It's really fascinating to see how these things play out.
Yeah, it really highlights the human element in all of this. Faith and relationships are so intertwined, it's hard to separate them.
And it raises so many questions about how communities deal with conflict, how they navigate authority and submission, how they handle personal grievances, and how they interpret scripture and tradition.
Absolutely. It's a real challenge to determine a single truth from these contrasting accounts.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What's something they should think about after hearing all of this?
I think this story really forces us to consider how communities, especially faith communities, deal with disagreements, how they maintain unity when there are conflicts, and how they balance individual interpretation with communal beliefs. It's a complex and nuanced issue with no easy answer.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah.
So, thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Take care.
Bye bye.